before the video begins, I just want to apologise. I've just went and rewatched it all, and there's a very, very, very slight buzzing throughout the movie as we're recording, and I just realised that my microphone wasn't fully plugged in the entire time. It was plugged in, but it wasn't plugged in enough to stop the buzzing, and I've already filmed this entire video twice, so I'm not doing it again. My apologies. It shouldn't bother you too much, but my apologies. Alright everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ram's Astro Talking Timelines. This is actually the second time I've had to film this entire video. I filmed it all yesterday, and when I went to edit it I realised I filmed it in the wrong format and everything was at 90 degrees facing the wrong way, and when I tried to fix it, the image get messed up, so here I am refilming it. So today we're talking about the timeline of the franchise Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I love this horror movie franchise. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of my favourite horror movies. If you remember from my top 13 horror movie list back in the channel, plug. So without dilly-dallying, let's get into this because I've already talked about this once in the last 24 hours. So just like the Halloween timeline, their first timeline begins with the original movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre by Tobe Hooper. I love this film. I love it. If you've not seen any of these movies, I'm not going to spoil what happens in them. I'm just going to give you a brief synopsis from what I've seen on IMDb to give you the gist, but don't spoil it. So IMDb says, 5 friends head out to rural Texas to visit a grandfather's grave. On the way there, they pick up a deranged hitchhiker as well as finding a seemingly empty farmhouse. So yeah, that's a basic gist of the plot, but yeah, there is a chainsaw wielding maniac. It's very famous for being a brutal horror film, but I don't see this original movie as brutal. I'm going to say about 95% of the brutality comes from your own mind, because there's next to no blood seen on screen, there's next to no gore. You see maybe a few seconds worth of gore in the entire movie, but a lot of the blood and brutalness is in your own mind. It's suggested in your mind, fills in those gaps and makes you think you've seen what you've seen. When you see people being hung on hooks, you don't see the hooks going in, you don't see any blood, your mind makes you think you've seen that. So it's very well done. I love the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I recommend it highly. So this original timeline, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is followed by, naturally, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, also from Tobe Hooper and starring Dennis Hopper. Now this movie takes place, I'm sure it's like a year, maybe a few months later, but IMDb says, a radio host is victimised by the cannibal family as a former Texas Marshal hunts down the family. So yeah, it's just a basic gist of what's going on. The Texas Marshal, I'm sure he's a relation to one of the people who died in the first movie, and he's looking for revenge. It is over the top, this movie. This movie is very over the top, and I love it for it. It's not subtle in any way. There is a bit more gore. It's just non-stop, over the top action and horror. It's what you expect from the 80s. What do you expect? It's non-stop, and it's from the original director. So this is the original timeline. This is the pure timeline, as a lot of fans consider it. But that's it. So let's move on to timeline number 2. So yeah, we've moved on to a new timeline. So this new timeline starts with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from Tobe Hooper. Yeah, so when they tried to do a soft reboot of this, they probably thought, there's no way we can top that original movie, let's just pretend the second one didn't happen. So the second installment in this timeline is called Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Now don't let that title fool you. It may be called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, but it pretends that number 2 didn't happen. There's no reference to it. It doesn't even mention it. It just basically, it feels like it's a direct sequel almost to the original. It ignores the middle one altogether. So just ignore that number 3. It might as well just be called Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It is. This one is also very over the top. I don't remember it much because I've only seen this movie maybe once or twice, and it has been at least 10 years since I last watched it. watched it, so let's see what IMDb has to say. A California couple and a survivalist encounter Leatherface and his lunatic family. So yeah, that's all IMDb says about this movie. I don't remember it much, but I do remember the cool massive chainsaw with the giant blade that says the saw is family. So yeah, so it's very 80s, and I'm pretty sure that guy from the Lord of the Rings is in this one. What's his name? Viggo Mortensen, there he is on the back, Viggo Mortensen. He's in this one. It's very over the top. As you can see, look at that, there's Leatherface wielding his chainsaw. If you don't want to watch the original timeline, try this one out. It might be for you. It might be the right blend of old school horror and then some over the topness, just like the last timeline. Let's move on to timeline number 3. So yeah, we're on to the third timeline in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. So yeah, we're technically on the 4th movie and 3rd timeline. So yeah, that's how this series is going. So the first installment of this timeline is, once again, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All these soft reboots are basically going, the original can't be topped, let's just keep starting with that one. Not going to go into it. The next movie is called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation, and it stars Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger. So there we go. I've seen this movie once. I didn't really like it. I've not watched it since. And that's got, oh, Jesus, that's about 15 years ago when I bought this DVD. So I've not watched it since. So I can't remember much about it. And I remember I was pretty drunk when I watched it. Or I wasn't drunk, I was having a couple of drinks. So let's see what IMDb has to say for this movie. A group of teenagers get into a car crash in the Texas woods on prom night and wander into the farmhouse that is home to Leatherface and his family. So once again, it's like a soft reboot. It's several years after this original. I think it's like 10, maybe 15 years later. I don't remember much except there was a female Leatherface. That's all I remember about this one. It is a soft reboot. Continuing on. I wouldn't recommend this timeline. I would just avoid this one in general. So yeah, that's all I really can say about this one. So that's timeline number 3. So let's move on to the next timeline. So yeah, this timeline starts off with, as you guessed it, the Texas Chainsaw. I'm only kidding, it doesn't start off with that one. But it does start off with this, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is a full-blown remake. This one decided we're going to remake this for modern audiences. I'm sure Michael Bay was involved at some point in the movie. Let's have a look now. I'm sure Michael Bay was involved somewhere. Now, a lot of people don't like this remake, but me personally, I really like this remake. I think it's great. It's not as good as the original, but it's a few steps below. It's brutal, and it fleshes out the family of murderers a little more, which I enjoyed. It gives a bit more reasoning behind things, and it adds some extra characters that weren't in the original. It changes things up enough to make it fresh. So let's see what IMDb have got to say. After picking up a traumatized hitchhiker, 5 friends find themselves stalked and hunted by a deformed chainsaw-wielding lunatic and his family of psycho killers. Yeah, that is a nice watered-down description of this movie. There is some extra characters. The hitchhiker is completely different in this one. Instead of being part of the lunatic family, the hitchhiker appears to be a previous victim of the family. And instead of there being a deranged hitchhiker, you've got a deranged sheriff after the group of friends, which adds a nice fresh taste to the movie. He is just as crazy as everyone else in his family. It's brilliant. So this movie, instead of getting a sequel, got a prequel. So technically I should have started with this, but I'm doing it in the order that it came out. So the first point in this timeline is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning. So this one I remember enjoying, but nowhere near as much as this one. I've watched this one a lot more than I've watched this one. So this one is set, I'm pretty sure it's like a year, maybe 5. I'm going to say about 5 years tops. I've not looked into that, but it's not too far before the original one, not too far before it. It kind of sets up events that eventually lead into this one, but let's see what IMDb has to say. Before being sent to Vietnam, Two brothers and their girlfriends take one last road trip, but an accident brings them to the home of Leatherface and his family. So this movie sets up a lot of, as I said, a lot of stuff that happens in this movie, like the sheriff being crazy and whatnot, but I enjoy it. I've not watched it in a long time. I've not watched that one in a while, actually. I could be doing with a little marathon with both of them at some point in my near future. But yeah, if you're not a fan of old horror movies and like a bit more modernness, I recommend this timeline. Maybe start off with this one. But otherwise, it's really good. Let's move on to the next timeline. Right, as with the previous timeline, I'm going to show these movies in the order they were released, not in chronological story order. So the first chapter in this timeline is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This one is very popular to begin off timelines. So this one, I'm not going to go over it, it's a classic, it's original, but the next movie is set many years after, and it's simply just called Texas Chainsaw. It removes the word "the" and massacre. This one, at the time, a lot of people panned it. I think it's a fun horror film. It's not great. It's got some really good moments in it. There's a lot of continuity errors which really bug me, but if you turn off that part of your brain while watching it, you will enjoy it as the fun, fresh movie that it is. But let's see what IMDb has to say about the story. A young woman travels to Texas to collect an inheritance. Little does she know that an encounter with a chainsaw-wielding killer is part of the package. Yep. So that's the basic gist. I don't really want to say too much because there is some good twists and turns in the movie. When I say good, if you've got your brain turned off, they're good. If you're paying attention, they're not too good, but they're very predictable. But I enjoyed it. It does follow, I think it's set like 20, 30 years later. And as I said, a lot of continuity errors bugger up that it's supposed to be 20, 30 years later, but in reality it's a lot longer or something like that. But just pretend that it makes sense and you'll enjoy it. So the next part of this timeline is a prequel to the original. So that wasn't the first chapter on this timeline, that's why he's sitting there. But I'm doing this in the order that they came out. And the next one is called Leatherface. Leatherface. So this one is a prequel to the original. Now I've not seen Leatherface, so I can't tell if it's good or bad. I haven't really heard much about it. It kind of came out and I wanted to see it. I forgot all about it, never got round to it. So that's why it's still sealed. This DVD is still sealed. I haven't got round to watching it. But I think I will get round to watching it soon. So let's see what IMDb has to say about the story. A teenage Leatherface escapes from a mental hospital with three other inmates, kidnapping a young nurse and taking her on a road trip from hell while being pursued by the law. Now, that does sound quite good. It sounds very similar to maybe Free from Hell, Devil's Rejects, which, judging by maybe the trailers I've seen back in the day, it did kind of remind me of the Devil's Rejects a little. Maybe that's what they were going for. Devil's Rejects is a damn good film. But yeah, so that's this timeline. It's the first in the Chainsaw family to have 3 chapters. This is the longest timeline in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So if you're looking for a timeline that'll keep you going for a few days, if you're watching one movie a night, this is the one I recommend, even if I've not seen that. So I do not know if I can recommend it, but I will probably watch that after this video comes out. So let's move on to the current and final timeline. Yeah, so that's us on the final timeline of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. At point of recording this video, who knows, in the future I'll probably do another reboot, but at this point there's a new timeline going on, and it begins with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre original. This movie is extremely popular for beginning timelines. Extremely popular. So yeah, so I don't need to go into that, but the new one, it comes out this week, so this video comes out on the Monday, and I'm sure the new movie comes to Netflix on the Thursday. So it'll come out in a few days. I've not seen it yet, can't recommend it. It is simply just called Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So they've just removed the word "the." There is there. So I've not seen it yet. The trailer came out last week or the week before, and I actually quite enjoyed what I seen in the trailer. The original teaser trailer had me thinking, meh, but a second trailer made me think, oh, this looks like a fun-filled film. It doesn't look great, but it looks fun. And it looks like they're going on the route of the new Halloween timeline. But before we get to that, let me just give you the gist of what it's about. Nearly 50 years of hiding, Leatherface returns to terrorise a group of young friends who accidentally disrupt his carefully shielded world in a remote Texas town. So from the sounds of things, Leatherface has been hiding from the law, hiding from people in general since the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He likes his peace and quiet. People have came in, interrupted it, so he dusts off his chainsaw wielding skills. So if it's 50 years later, how old was Leatherface in this original? I'm going to say he was in his 20s, so he's got to be at least in his 50s at this point. I know 50s, 70s. He's got to be in his 70s. Can he still pick up a chainsaw and kill teenagers? Or can a teenager just push him over? We'll see when the movie comes out. We shall see. If Michael Myers can still do it, Leatherface certainly can still do it. It looks good. So let me just move on to our final thoughts. Alright, so my final thoughts on this series. I do enjoy these movies. I've watched some more than others. Mainly I've watched the original a lot more than the rest. I do enjoy the remake. But the timeline I would probably recommend to newcomers to the series. Newcomers most. I'd probably recommend it. If you're a fan of old school horror, I would probably start with that timeline, the original. If you don't mind old school horror but like a bit of new school horror, I'd maybe go for the second last timelines where you get that one, Chainsaw and Leatherface. Although I still haven't seen Leatherface, but it has a mix of old school and new school. And also there's the remake trilogy. I recommend, no, not trilogy, double bill. Recommend that, even if it's just that one. Recommend just watching that movie. Those two movies I would try and not avoid, but if you want to be a completionist, you can get them out of the way. But I'd avoid Next Generation. It's not that great. It is not that great, but I've had fun. I'm going to watch that new movie, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, when it comes out this week. I'm looking forward to it. I'll probably rewatch the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre leading up to that, which means I'll give me an excuse to watch Leatherface finally, even though it's not part of that timeline. I'll get it out of the way and then I can say I've seen them all. So, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Is there any other timelines you would like me to cover? Because I know there's a few movies, TV shows and things out there that have done a bunch of soft reboots or remakes and continued timelines and things like that. That's confusing to newcomers who just want to jump in and have a good time. And if I know about it, I'll cover it. If you just let me know, comment below, send me a tweet, Instagram message, Facebook message. It's all the information is down in the description below. And if you're a newcomer to the channel and you're still with us on the video, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please hit us with a like or subscribe. This is only the second Talkin Timelines video, but we do have one on the Halloween franchise. I also have other videos on the channel covering video games, action figures, wrestling, Ghostbusters, you name it, it's on there. So if you're a vintage viewer, thank you for coming back. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, don't forget, have a good one.